Else
Realm
Diners. Hello, I'm Mark,
And I'm Ruth.
and welcome back to the Else Realm Diner. It came from the swirling depths of the multiverse, a sentient cafe, a cosmic mystery, transporting its clientele through all manner of realms. No one knows where the diner came from. All we know is that it seeks interesting conversation, warm memories, and good banter.
On the menu today is the 1922 German expressionist silent movie Nosferatu.
Nosferatu. Exactly, yes. A film that was filmed in 1921. The filming was actually in the summer of 1921, which makes sense because lighting was potentially an issue, but we'll come back to that in a moment. But it was released in 1922, and that makes it 100 years old. And for a 100-year-old movie, it has... Well, actually, something I think that we were both reflecting upon was the fact that, on the one hand, it feels like a really long time ago. On the other hand, though, 100 years isn't actually that long ago. And considering how much technology has moved on in those 100 years, it's quite impressive. If you go from Nosferatu to, for example, yesterday, James Cameron's Avatar, Way of the Water was released, it's leaps and bounds in terms of special effects and storytelling. But also you can see, though, incipient camera techniques and a desire to use the medium in interesting ways that clearly has inspired movie making for the past century. So this is a really important film, but also actually the subject matter is interesting, not only in terms of the story it's telling, but also in terms of the story of the production of the film.
Yeah.
So
the history of the film is almost that we nearly don't have it today. So originally, the writers wrote the story of Bram Stoker's Dracula after Bram Stoker's death, and it was denied being associated with the Bram Stoker estate.
Yeah, Bram Stoker's wife had widow. Sorry, yes, of course, was managing his estate at that point, and set the lawyers on this German production company, who actually had set up in 1921, so they were brand new.
Previous to that, though, they'd pitched the script, they'd said no, so all they did was change some of the names of the characters.
Well, exactly, yeah.
And basically nothing else.
No, and so she wasn't impressed. It was clearly a work that was based on Bram's novel. And interestingly enough, what we learned while watching it was that we only have this film because one copy survived in London. One of the legal stipulations of the Bram Stoker estate was that all copies of the movie had to be destroyed, and one copy was found in storage in a place in London. It's amazing that it survived, well, by accident. And actually, that's one of the things. Just for a moment, as an archaeologist, I'm particularly interested in is the fact that this weird relationship we have between how we tell stories about the past and the real mechanisms by which things actually survive. It may well be that an awful lot of the things that we go, oh yes, the Romans did this. We only say that because certain things survive by accident. So this film survived by accident, but it's a crucial document in terms of early filmmaking and
early horror movies as well. I mean, some of the shadow techniques and the filming backwards and the filming at speed and
changing the frame rates.
That's that classic sort of angled stand up from the coffin, like rotating about the feet and standing vertically upright from horizontal, came from this movie, and in that sense it created the tropes that now litter horror movies.
But also as well, it's interesting how yes, I mean there were these sort of visual tropes and use of long shadows to sort of forebode
Hmm.
the approach of the monster and so on and so forth. But I suppose the first thing that really struck me upon watching Nosferatu was the fact that this is a very different way of doing film. I mean, I was just saying how 100 years isn't that long. It is in terms of the development of storytelling tropes and what I suppose what the director and the film experience expects from you as an audience member. Because actually, what I think what we found was that the pace of the film and the way that it relies on sometimes inserted words to sort of give you a sense of what people are saying, and sometimes it relies upon people's expressions or seeing someone and how they move through the set meant that actually we could do a lot of talking to each other while the film was playing, and we weren't really losing a lot of the story. In fact, any of it
Yeah.
I would say. Whereas if you went to, I don't know, a John Wick movie and you talked through the beginning of that, then someone might get annoyed with you, you know.
This is a
Sorry,
very controversial
yeah,
topic.
yeah, I'm so I'm referencing we should just call it Muffin Gate. We'll
We
leave it
should.
there.
I literally can't believe you've just brought that up.
We'll leave it there. But the point is, some people will get very antsy about people talking in the cinema or through a movie, whereas this one actually it felt as though there was space for you to comment on what was happening on screen, to talk about and think about the character motivations, and also as well to really get into I think on multiple levels, the story. Because on the one hand, we found ourselves slightly sort of going, "Oh, off he goes, the jolly man to Transylvania. Was it the land of
Yeah.
thieves and
Yeah.
brigands, that kind of
Fools or
thing?"
something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so you could sort of comment on the actor, but also comment and think about the story as well. I mean, especially there's also the role of his wife just going, "Oh, you've gone away," and
Yeah.
he's writing a
Well,
letter
that
saying,
was one of the things that I think has actually moved on culturally. It's like, when I mean, we do it now, but we don't see it as much as there's kind of like gestures and um turns of like movements of hand. I know that's a gesture as well, but like eyes and stuff that actors make that maybe aren't what you would literally do in a situation, but means to us that you are flirting or happy or sad or
"Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
crying.
mm-hmm,
And I think what I find when I watch a silent movie is that those movements and gestures are slightly alien to a modern audience.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
What they may have understood as a woman leaning her head into a man's shoulder and blinking um, was a seems to be, and again I'm making judgments here from watching silent movies, seems to be a legitimate way of encouraging a man's flirtatious affections, whereas when I'd first looked at that felt very forward.
mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm.
but the way it was received within the context of the story seems to be that was them just saying that they're receiving those attentions happily, and that then this is becoming a mutually romantic scenario. And there were things like that where I was kind of like, oh, that wouldn't have been what I thought that meant.
Well,
And in that sense, sorry.
it's interesting that actors these days they often contrast cinema and theatre performances. So in a theatre performance, you have to do everything big. You're sort of performing to the back row, so people can see your facial expressions, can get a sense of your emotions, and sometimes it feels as though you're over egging the pudding just to be able to be seen by the back of the theatre.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe here there was a little bit of that going on. The sort of
Oh no, it definitely is.
hmm.
But what I mean is they seem to have a set
Like a
of
visual
gestures.
vocabulary.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, that's what I was trying to. They seem to have a visual vocabulary that the audiences at the time would have known and understood, and
Hmm.
that me as a modern viewer going into it
Hmm.
was trying to learn and figure out. And at some points it was quite alien. They were doing things so there's this sense of like the woman, like especially in the courtship stuff, and I'm talking about other silent movies as well, where there's this kind of, the woman doesn't give in straight away. There's
Mm-hmm.
is it demurs, where she sort of pulls back
Yeah.
and is all like, no, I couldn't possibly, and there's this kind of ritual that happens, which again is played out like in the 50s movies, but in a different way. And it's played out again in modern cinema, but in a different way. And so when you come back to look at something that's made at a time like that, when the cultural norms and understandings of it, or the vocabulary of it, basically has changed, and because they're having to do everything visually, it was quite interesting to see what they were doing, and it wasn't always 100% clear to me what they were doing. But then you watch that, so like I would watch something in like Nosferatu, and then I'd watched a couple of other silent movies, and you see those same expressions, turns of the head, whatever that they do, and then you're like, oh, it means this. And there would have, as I say, been this collective understanding of what that meant.
Yeah. Well, I think in the past you've mentioned to me how watching the faces that people pull in for example, Asian cinema sometimes.
Yeah, Japanese cinema, yeah.
Yeah. And I've definitely noticed it in for example, South Korean movies.
Yeah, South Korean movies, I've seen it in as well.
Yeah, sometimes a face that might look slightly manic and almost forced happy can mean someone is scared, or someone is having an internal moment that the audience recognizes, but that actually maybe in real life people don't really pull that face when they're thinking and feeling that. It's a
but
cue,
also those faces, the natural faces in it, and I don't know if this is true in all of Asia, but it definitely is true between like Japan and England. The actual facial expressions that the Japanese pull to represent an emotion is a learned thing. Well, it's a learned thing for all cultures, but they are different in Japan and England.
Yeah, and then in Wales they're different again. In Scotland they're different again.
Are they?
No, I'm joking. It's just the
Well, no, but I was saying England deliberately.
Oh, okay.
Because that's all I could talk about. I wasn't excluding the United Kingdom.
My chip is showing this morning, clearly.
Well, that was a deliberate choice because I couldn't speak for other nations. Oh, my God.
Chip on my shoulder.
Well, you've got a real chip on your shoulder about that one. That was a deliberate choice to not speak outside of my knowledge base.
Yes, absolutely, you're right. And there are, I mean, for example, this is getting slightly off topic, but when watching a range of different YouTube channels that are based in Japan, it's interesting how often people, when they're talking about what's it like to first come to Japan, one of the key things is things like body language and that relationship between intent. And actually, I suppose one of the things that lots of Western travelers or people who move and live to live in Sendai or in Tokyo, this kind of thing, they find themselves having to relearn, because initially what they feel is that either people are being insincere or they're being really rude to them. So I suppose what we're getting at is the fact that these visual cues are not only cultural, but also in the case of performance, were clearly baked into early cinema, and I think some of them have continued, and some of them have been expanded as tropes, as you say. Things like the use of shadow, things like I mean, I was going to say Willem Dafoe in various performances has carried on some of these traditions in terms of the use of face, but actually, obviously, he is in a version of this movie that we went on to watch, but I guess we'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah, I think if we come back to that in a little bit. But
yeah,
yes.
But what I mean, so as the film progressed, we start off with is it Max? No, Max Schreck is the actor in the in the follow up. But we start off with basically these names which are scarcely changed from the novel, but changed just enough, they thought, to avoid
copyright.
Yeah, being sued. And this patent clerk, this lawyer type person is entrusted with a mission to go to Romania in order to secure the purchase of a house in his hometown. So it's set in the fictional German town of Wisborg, and Thomas Hutter instead of, is it
Harker,
Harker?
Harper or Harker. I think it's
Yeah,
Harker.
Thomas Hutter sent to Transylvania by his employer Hernock to visit
It
Count
doesn't meet. Oh yeah,
Orlok.
sorry.
Count
Count.
Orlok.
Oh, is it Orlok or not? I thought it was Olaf.
No, it's Orlok.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Orlok to buy a house which is just across from Hutter's own home.
I know how intriguing. It's literally across the road.
um, and crucially, it looks. I mean, it looks as though they chose a place called Lubeck, I think, as the set for Orlok's house in Visborg. But it looks, frankly, it looked abandoned in the movie, didn't it? It looked
Mm.
like an abandoned warehouse type structure. And there's a photo here on the Wikipedia page which doesn't make it look much better, I have to say. So, from I think it must have been, yeah, it's a photo taken in the 1970s, I think. So apparently this mysterious count wants to purchase this house. He's sent off to this land of thieves and ghouls and ghosts, and finds himself in. Well, see, this is what I find interesting about, again, this visual vocabulary, because we know from the Bram Stoker novel that it's strongly hinted that Dracula himself performs various roles in order to make it seem as though he is not living alone in his castle.
Yeah,
So
he's like
he,
his servant,
yeah,
the driver.
which
Yeah,
is objectively hilarious. This idea of this going.
yeah.
Oh no, you might think I'm alone, and then just going around. Hello, no, I am the I am the coach driver. I'm not the master of the house. But there's this fascinating thing where they use a sped up frame rate. Played back. A slowed down frame rate played back at 24 frames ish a second, to have the cart, the horse and cart, speed into shot as
Yeah.
Thomas is waiting for it, and he's sort of beckoned in by this masked figure who's clearly Count Orlok. You can see his eyebrows and things. He's got
Oh,
a
yeah.
hat and a scarf on, and then it zooms off again. It's almost got that sort of Benny Hill. If you put the wrong music to it, if you put the it would look hilarious. But actually, what they were doing, and again, I think you have to consciously watch it with the mindset of someone who hasn't seen the next 100 years of cinema.
Yeah, but I still think it manages to be sinister.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so they're invoking it's otherworldly, it's eerie, it's something that your eyes
Mm.
don't see in the real world, and it's a camera trick that we still use to this day. You know, you can slow things down, speed things up, just change the frame rate that you shoot it at to maintain the image quality, and you can achieve these effects. And I think they did really well. One thing that I wasn't expecting though was the use of color. So certain scenes are tinted blue, others are tinted sort of orangey red, and they're meant to invoke nighttime or sort of slightly magical or mysterious
Mm.
kind of vibes, this kind of thing. So it's not actually just a black and white or even a sepia film. It's actually got little hints of color. But what did you make of that balance between these visual effects and this clearly really inspired German director in particular, and the camera crew, and that balance between sort of comedy versus sinister intent? Actually, do you think it did a good job of conveying the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the first time I watched it. I mean, bearing in mind that was quite a few years ago now, but
Hmm.
the first time I watched it, I mean, I kind of went in not really knowing what I was expecting, and you know, I had really seen Bram Stoker's Dracula, I suppose, was sort of like I'd seen that, and I was like, oh, this is this is
Hmm.
the original story or whatever, and so I'd kind of not really got much of a clue about what was going on. But I mean, I did find it quite sinister, quite scary. I found the the portrayal of Count Orlok was really, really unpleasant at times. He was really very creepy.
Hmm.
You know, I his makeup and stuff was done really well. His presence on screen was very well done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think how they did create magic, and I say magic in him because it seemed to be that they were creating this otherworldliness about him, weren't they?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that I thought was done very well. And I think you're right. If you watched it with a modern eye, with the wrong music to it,
Mm.
it would be, it could potentially in places verge on comic. But I
Mm.
think because it was played straight, you knew it was meant to be straight, you knew it was almost a historical piece.
Mm.
And yes, maybe you do have to adjust your mindset to that. But I mean, I felt invested in the film.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I felt invested in the Count. I was invested in that monster. I was invested in the world that it created. It it's it played the story well for me to enjoy and like it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's interesting because you talk about the balance of music. When we were watching the DVD version, your DVD version, I was interested in what actually would people have been hearing at the time, because actually the score that came with the film had at times almost industrial kind of clanging um, and and a rhythm to it that felt it was invoking horror and tension to us. But I wondered whether or not that would have been in the original score. Turns out the original, they did come with a score composed by Hans Erdmann, which would be performed by an orchestra at the film's Berlin premiere. However, most of the score for the film was lost, and what remained, just reading from the wiki page here, is a partial adapted suite. And so, throughout the history of Nosferatu's screenings, many composers and musicians have written or improvised their own soundtracks to accompany the film. James Bernard, composer of soundtracks for many Hammer horror movies in the 50s and 60s, wrote a score for the reissue of the movie. And Bernard's score was released in 1997 by Silver Screen Records, apparently. A version of Erdmann's original score was reconstructed by musicologists and composers. Gillian Anderson, no, not that one, and James Kessler, and James Kessler was released in 1995 by BMG Classics. I think that's the one that's on the DVD that we watched.
Yeah.
But as a reconstruction, I think they built into it synthesized elements, and maybe a parts of it was this slightly sort of almost industrial sound that I think works well, especially in the context of this German impressionistic world. This kind of
Mm-hmm.
transition from, because the movie itself, even though it's filmed in 1922, it's set in the 1850s, isn't it? 1858,
Mm-hmm.
I seem to recall. 1838, sorry, 1838. So, so it's interesting how they're depicting a vision of a rural Europe that's kind of on its way out of almost medieval serfdom into the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And so I think the soundtrack kind of works for that. But also as well, therefore, what did you make of because I thought the castle that they chose it was already a bit of a ruin that he was living in, and also they were doing lots of sort of shooting of day for night because of lighting.
Mm-hmm.
Be like, you need light, and portable lights weren't necessarily all that easy on location, particularly at this time in the 1920s. But what did you think of that relationship between, I suppose, the rural and the urban? Because when they come back towards the end of the film, back to Visborg, and they're chasing the monster through the monster, and also the lawyer who sold the house to him through the town over the rooftops and this kind of thing. It looks like a 1920s town, and of course it does, because it was. But
Mm.
therefore, do you think there's anything there in terms of the mysticism, the sort of the little book that Hutter is handed when he first stays at the inn, when he arrives in Transylvania, and then this sort of contrast with this urban, suburban German.
Yeah, I mean, I do get this sense that the story of Dracula and the story that's told there is this sense of this age-old creature trying to move into the modern world.
Hmm.
and him trying to move away from this, rural isolation that he's basically in, into kind of a city. And I mean, in the original book, he's actually trying to buy 10 locations in London.
Yeah.
So that he's got all these kind of dart holes he can go to, whereas in this one he's just buying one. It's actually quite a broken down, simpler version of the story.
So I'm just laughing because I've just seen a photo of Shrek the vampire in on set, basically just in one of these properties that he's trying to buy, and so, not to interrupt you, but I love the hands, the fingers, everything about his performance is excellent.
But I think as well he was the first vampire that had ever been shown, and I think it's interesting to see how the monster of the vampire has gone and changed, because his teeth that are the fangs literally protrude, and I think they're the front two, are they?
I think so. Yeah, yeah. It's almost like he
Yeah.
has a sort of Bugs Bunny kind of overbite. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and then you have, he's bald, he's very pale, and he's got these kind of elongated fingers that look very alien. And, and that's not really how you see vampires portrayed now. They tend to have normal teeth that only, extend when they're about to feed. It tends to be the incisors? What are the ones the pointed corn?
Canines.
Canines, yes. It tends to be the canines that extend rather than the incisors. And you tend to have them blending a lot more into a modern setting. And you get the sense that that's what Dracula Orlok are trying to do. They're trying to move into the modern world, that they're sort of stuck, pinned, isolated into this past. And I think that that's what this film was therefore doing, wasn't it? It was talking about this rural rundown castle where he lives on his own, and he's maintaining it himself. He's doing everything because people won't go near his castle. And he wants to kind of infiltrate into a place that's densely populated, urban, moving with the times, and modern, industrialized in that sense. So I think that that's very, I think that is his attempt at doing that, and he's ultimately unsuccessful.
Yeah, well, he's unsuccessful, but also as well, I think counter to your Edwards of this world and your
sparkly vampires.
and your Interview with a Vampire sort of take on things. He's so obviously not human. In that sense, there's not much. There's really, it's, as you say, it's doomed to failure because he can't fit in with this place. He can't live in this town, really.
No.
But nonetheless, he does try. And I think one of the things I find interesting, but also unfortunate, is the fact that the look of the character, the actor Max Schreck, as Count Orlok, who apparently actually looks like his wife or some family member, Fanny Schreck, plays the hospital nurse in the movie, which is quite cool.
Oh, really?
Yeah, according to the cast list. But the way that they made him look went on to be associated with stereotypical caricatures of Jewish people and also other marginalized groups.
Well, that's not good.
It's not good, but what's interesting is that it's this sort of I know you said carrot and egg then. What is this chicken and egg thing? Carrot and stick, chicken and egg. It's a chicken and egg thing where it looks as though when you actually unpick it, the director Murnau was actually not. He didn't have a problem with Jews. He had friends and he was actually quite protective of Jewish men and women during his life. And what he was portraying was a monster. But it's interesting that monster, especially so some of the visuals on the ship, for example, when he's coming to Germany, have him surrounded by crates of earth that are filled, spilling over with rats, for example,
Oh yeah.
and disease and this kind of thing. And it's interesting how these images, going back to this notion of being a viewer at the time, they were so potent that when people wanted to invoke hatred of other people, they used these images to do so.
Do you think that's the same? Do you think that's partly invoking the monster in the Jewish population from the German propaganda at the time of the Nazis?
Yeah, I think
Oh God,
eventually it
that's
would
so
go on to do that.
scary.
Cause, yeah, but again, it's one of those things where
Gotta,
art imitates life in so much as invoking disgust. But then when you want to invoke disgust, maybe people are then using the art to take it a step further.
do you know, I hadn't even made that connection. That's incredibly scary.
So in that sense, the film is undoubtedly iconic. It's iconic for horror movie lovers. It's iconic for the history of cinema. It's iconic for some of the wrong reasons in terms of how it created associations and easily manipulated emotional seeds that people would take advantage of as we went into the 1930s and onwards. But the story, as iconic as it is, also does deviate from the novel. We've sort of tinted at the fact that Harker, Jonathan and Mina Harker, the names are slightly changed there. Count Dracula is not the same as Orlok in so much as Orlok does not create other vampires. Orlok kills his victims, which causes the town to be much more aware of a plague that's ravaging the city, supposedly. Orlok must sleep by day, because sunlight might kill him, whereas the original Dracula is only weakened by sunlight, which is something that when we came to watch, well, when I read part of, but also when we came to watch Bram Stoker's Dracula, I was reminded of the fact that, yeah, he can walk in the daylight, can't he? So,
well, actually, I think that's because that film probably has made more impact on the Dracula,
yeah,
on the vampire myth than the book in some ways.
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting how yeah, so many of these things that we now associate with vampires do come from this performance, from Nosferatu. And actually, it's interesting. I've always thought of Nosferatu as being a sort of a proto, almost in a species sense, a proto vampire, sort of a slightly more feral version of the vampire that we see in so much mass media today. But you were talking about, or you wanted to talk about how the end of the film is interesting.
Yeah. So in the book, he's chased across, I can't even remember, Europe, or I think it's Europe.
Yeah,
He's trying, it is, because he's trying to get back to his own home, and they're using his connection with Mina to locate him, to almost kind of track him, and then they kill him en route. Whereas in the Nosferatu movie, he is trying to feed on Mina, and it's the dawn that destroys him. The
Sunrise.
light comes through the window, and again, that's not canon as far as the Bram Stoker book is concerned. But that's also hinted at earlier in the movie, because there's a lot more mysticism, I think, in Nosferatu than there is really in the book, because you have that the main character's given that little book, isn't he?
Yeah.
Which is filled with symbols and stuff, and he doesn't really read it, even though it would help. And that has the legend of
Sorry. I mean, in so many ways, the character of Thomas Hutter is just he's a bit of a delightful fool, isn't he? So he's almost skipping his way through the film.
Yeah, and he does look remarkably like Eddie Izzard.
He does. He does.
Which we'll come back to shortly.
Yep. But yes, so he's handed this book, by a very superstitious old lady in the inn where he stays.
Yeah, and that sort of has the story in, doesn't it, of the demise of how to kill Nosferatu, or not necessarily how to kill him, but what will be his demise. And it's
Yeah.
like it's like to do with the cockerel crowing or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it pertains to the dawn, and that when he feeds on the blood of a virgin or something,
Yeah. Yeah.
the dawn will, the cock will crow and the dawn will take him or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this sort of sense that he is destined to be doomed, rather than his demise is just documented, if that makes sense. Which I
Yeah.
think is a difference in the book, that isn't quite so predestined,
Yeah. Well, and
predetermined.
this idea of when the cockerel crows, it struck me when I first heard about it. When we first heard and saw it unfolding, it struck me as being somewhat sort of pseudo biblical, actually. This idea of, by the time the cock crows 3 times, you'll have denied me, Peter. This kind of thing.
Yeah.
It had that kind of it was predestined. It was well, it was actually it's a setup and payoff. It's a classic
Yeah.
movie making trope. You have this thing at the beginning, which even now quite often, and I'm sure you're in a very similar situation, where often I'll watch a film and they'll be like, I don't know, this chewing gum, for example, Mission Impossible. If you squeeze these 2 bits together, it'll explode. And you're like, I'm sure that's going to come in handy at some point during the film.
Yeah.
You,
Well, it's classic James Bond, isn't it?
exactly.
You get shown all the
Yeah,
devices, and you're like,
yeah,
how could that possibly ever be useful? And
yeah.
then
Oh, very
towards the
specific
chase scene, it's like,
circumstances.
oh yes, it's actually quite useful in that random place. Yeah.
Precisely, yeah, and so it's I suppose James Bond is actually the classic setup and payoff, and if they didn't pay off every single one of those gadgets, then it would be it would feel like a waste of time showing, is it? And so actually, it's interesting how, again, you have this sort of this cinematic trope unfolding, but what so what do you prefer to watch then between Nosferatu and Bram Stoker's Dracula? We'll come back to the Shadow of the Vampire in a moment, because that's almost like a meta response to the first one. But which do you prefer?
Do you know, I find that a really difficult question, because I almost think they're complementary of each other. Uh, I genuinely, okay, so I saw Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola one. It was 94, I believe. Maybe 92, maybe, I don't know. That was the first introduction really that I had to Dracula. As a as the original kind of Bram Stoker's. Obviously there'd been like, I think I'd seen Hammer Horror.
Yeah.
And like Count Duckula.
Do you know,
and obviously
before I
the
saw
Count.
Yeah, the Count in
One,
Sesame Street.
two, yeah.
Well, interestingly, before I saw Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola movie, I'd seen, is it Dracula 2000?
Oh, I don't even know.
Oh, that's an awful movie. Awful movie. It's actually known as Dracula 2001.
Oh.
Yeah, but it had its original title was Dracula 2000. Wes Craven Presents.
Oh, right, yeah.
And it's terrible. It's really, really bad. But anyway, so I'd seen really god awful Dracula movies before I saw that one. And actually, one of the things that sold me on it was there was an interview with Francis Ford Coppola where he was describing his attempt to convince studios to finance this thing. And people are like, well, who cares? We've seen it before, and also as well, the shadow of Nosferatu was still such that 80 odd years later, Hollywood didn't see the point of going back there.
Yeah.
And he said, well, have you ever actually read the book? And it sort of went on from there. So I found it interesting, the details that were included in it, and the and things like the way that Mina's character is, on the one hand, sort of seduced, but on the other hand, really very quickly becomes fanatically obsessed with him, actually.
Yeah, so I felt with that, that was kind of the glamour, wasn't it?
Mm,
Of like, is that her choice, or is
mm,
that part of his glamour in pulling her in?
mm-hmm.
Because she had bought in to the end, like at the end, she'd bought in, hadn't she, that she was his long lost love, and
Yeah.
that was who she wanted to be with.
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of get this sense at the end, don't you, that she
She
this
sort
was
of rescues them both with love.
yeah, but you get
Yeah.
this sense at the end as well, I think, that she's settling for Jonathan,
Mm, mm,
and that it's not the great love of her life, but the other one was kind of cursed.
mm,
And so
mm,
she has to have this slightly lesser, natural, proper love.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Maybe it's an allegorical of an affair. I can't run away with you because I have a husband.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but also as well, I mean, one of the things that I found interesting is the fact that the Bram Stoker's Dracula the movie is much more sexualized. When, for example, Keanu Reeves with his amazing British accent
Oh
turns
yes,
up and
the
is being
Brides of Dracula.
sort of seduced by the brides of Dracula. These three women. There's lots of boobage. Lots of sort of sexualized blood and this kind of stuff. And also actually Sadie Frost's character Lucy, whenever she's having a fit of the vampire in her bed, she's always got a boob out. Basically,
I
it,
think it's also she does quite a lot of like self-touching,
yeah.
sort of alluding to maybe masturbatory kind of activities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's something that happens in what is the laughter for?
I'm just like laughing at the masturbatory activities. Did I ever tell you that this is a slight aside, but I'm sure people listening might find it hilarious. Once when I was working at the Jorvik Viking Centre, well, actually, quite often when I worked there, we'd have tourists come through from around the world, and the weirdest ones were the often the American tourists, because they would want to know about just how people really lived in the past, but they wouldn't really have the language to discuss stuff that they thought was taboo. And as as you and I have talked about off podcast before, how particularly language around toilet or sex
Oh
or
yeah.
that kind of thing is very sort of very locked down. I'm going to the restroom, this kind of thing, as opposed to I'm
Yeah.
popping to the loo.
Or I'm popping to the shitter.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to do a dump in the shitter.
I like the urination station.
Yeah, so anyway, this woman she comes over to me and goes, "Hi there." I'm like, "Hello." She goes, I've just been on the ride and just wondering, how did the Vikings, how did they, well, and I'm like, what do you want to know? How did they sleep together? How did they get married? What did they eat? She goes, how did they? And then she just goes, anally cleanse. How did they anally cleanse? And I was like, I said to her, that's so much worse than just saying wipe their bums. Because it makes me think of tubes and colonic irrigation and all that kind of thing.
Douching.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's
They anally douched.
yeah. um, but actually, in that sense, the film I think plays Francis Ford Coppola's movie plays with sexual imagery, with pleasure and pain. And
Wait. Before we go on, how do Vikings anally cleanse? Sorry, you can't leave us on a cliffhanger
Yeah.
like that.
Why did the Viking cross the road? To anally cleanse. No, what did they wipe their bottoms? Moss was one of the main.
Moss? Okay, yeah.
For a
I was going
long
to say
time.
moss leaves.
Yeah. In fact,
Thank
okay.
you.
I feel like I do need to finish that, don't I? The the reason we know this is that at Jorvik, the biggest human, I think it's still the biggest modern human poo ever found was uncovered. So
Oh my God.
I loved your face there. What? Yeah, it's a log basically that looks like a Yule log almost, but it's basically
Oh my God.
yeah, petrified poop. And it's fantastic. It contains evidence of intestinal worm eggs, so we know that
Oh,
this guy had a problem with a tapeworm. We know that he had a very sort of coarse bread for breakfast, probably.
my
Um,
God.
yeah, and we also know that he, for some reason, maybe it was a prank that someone else had wrought on him, that he was using moss to wipe his bottom, in which there was a holly leaf. So he
Oh,
might have had like a ow moment while he was dropping his loaf. So
oh my God. I'm like, so much
it's like
unnecessary
I regret asking.
information.
Um,
Yeah.
Immediate regret. No, but
I blame you for
it's
this
actually
entire aside.
it's a really it's a really interesting poo. And but also as well,
Oh,
crucially, it was found in because actually they also had booths out the back of their people's the longhouses. Basically, everyone had a
oh
plot of
God.
land where you'd have basically a little sort of fenced off area where you could sit down and have a poo. So yeah, in fact, the word booth is a Viking word, and I'm rambling on now. This is way off topic. Poo and booths. The poo booth, poop booth, the shit station.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So it does. It plays with with blood, with bodies, with pleasure and pain, and with sort of animal.
We should mention that when Mark said it, he was referring to the movie and not the shit
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah, not the poop. Yeah, not the Viking poop. Do you know someone once dropped it? Actually, I handed it over to a child, and she went when I said,
You took
"Yeah,
Oh, it's petrified. Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah."
Okay.
Um, and and someone said, "What is this?" And I was like, "Oh, it's a Viking poo." And they went, "Ah!" And it just fell on the floor and smashed, broke in half. It was glued back together with some very special glue, and now it's in a perspex case, and no one can touch it. Such a shame. Such a shame. Anyway, yeah. So there's animalistic desire as well. So there's a point when Lucy's character in the garden during a storm is basically humping with the beast. He's
Mm.
portrayed as being a feral wolf-like creature.
That so
Um,
brings to me back to that phrase, the beast with two backs, you know.
yeah.
Like every
Hmm.
time I've watched that, I've been like that because that's Shakespearean, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like it just that was kind of that whole scene seemed to be kind of encouraging like the idea of sex being kind of bestial. That then
Mm.
this was actually a beast and his the brawl and yeah.
Well, and actually, I suppose what you have there in that movie is a very deliberate contrast, isn't there, between courtship and the formal approach to marriage, which is economically sound. It's the reason why
Mm.
Keanu Reeves' character has gone off to the Carpathians because this is his big break as a partner in the law firm. He'll be able to definitely afford to ask Mina to marry him. This very staid, proper, well thought out plan
And
versus
essentially though passionless because you
yeah.
know Winona Ryder is like literally going why won't you kiss me, Jonathan?
Exactly, exactly.
Like, and she's desperately trying to, and then there's also that scene, isn't there, where they're looking at, I mean it's pictures from the Kama Sutra, but I
Yeah.
don't think it's actually the Kama Sutra, but the pictures in there sort of like is a book about um how to have sex. And so there's these pictures and she's sort of discussing with Lucy going, I don't understand it. Can
Yeah.
a man and a woman really do that?
And she's
It's
like,
like,
"Oh, I
oh,
did just yesterday." Oh,
in
says
my
Lucy. In my
dreams.
dreams. Yeah.
And then we get to this whole diatribe about how Lucy, although she's completely over sexualized, is really very virtuous.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's ever so virtuous, don't you know? As
Exactly.
she's got her boob flapping about and rubbing herself.
It's an interesting contrast, I think. Yeah, between social structure and
Mm,
propriety, and
propriety.
the way in which Dracula is just slicing through that and just well, actually, he's having his way with Lucy, but then he's romancing Mina.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, so it's like he's just hungry. He's literally thirsty in the very 2022 sense of the word.
Yeah.
But also as well, he is nonetheless trying to have a kind of a romance,
Yeah, and
and a
actually he
seduction.
really does kind of meet Mina and they do have an affair, don't they? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not
Mm-hmm.
a I mean, it's a staid affair in the
Mm.
sense that like she's still a virgin and stuff, but
Mm.
they do kind of and ultimately she rejects him to
Yes.
marry Jonathan,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which sort of breaks him a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It does.
I mean,
Yeah.
that was actually the biggest criticism I think of the Bram Stoker's Dracula, the movie,
Mm.
because he turned it into a romance
Well,
and
the tagline from the film was "Love never dies."
yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, strictly speaking, that was a reinterpretation of the original text because it wasn't. You know, when you read the book, you don't really see it as a great love story between Mina and Dracula. You see it much more as a beast has captured and enthralled this innocent woman, and that they're doing everything they can, and that once he's destroyed, that
Mm.
hold that he has on her is broken, and she's
Actually,
freed, but she's never quite the same again.
yeah, yeah. So you've got psychosexual, social. That's a nice triple S.
Well,
Themes
yeah.
there. Oh no, no, no. Psycho is P. Rats. Um,
Well,
Phonetically. Um, but also, actually, I think when you have, you said Ewan McGregor then, and when you have Anthony Hopkins's uh, uh,
Van,
Helsing come
yeah.
into the story, you have this butting of heads of again mysticism and something more recognizably modern. He is a
Mm.
scientist. He's an eccentric doctor.
Oh my god!
You
Do you
know.
know? Can I just say,
Hmm.
listen, right? He gave her, like, he gives Lucy a blood transfusion,
Yeah.
and there is no attempt to try and match blood type.
No.
So
No.
she could very easily
Go into shock
have
or something. Yeah.
died.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm just like, and I accept that it was an emergency situation. If she hadn't have done it, they she possibly would have died. But I was just sitting there watching it going, oh my god, that's so not okay.
Indeed. What about informed consent? Oh my
Yeah,
god.
it was and they were like, they were all going, I'll give her the blood, I'll give her the blood. It's
Yeah.
like,
I'll give her my
but
blood. Yeah.
and it was just like, honestly, like, that just made, I was just like, that's so dangerous, so dangerous.
Well, actually,
And then
well, interestingly, the blood types were first discovered in 1900. So, to be fair, Helsing probably wouldn't have known about this in the
no, but they
1850s or 60s.
knew that not everybody survived
Blood
a blood
transfusions. Yeah,
transfusion.
yeah.
You know, so that was the point. Is like they were all desperate to give her the blood, and it was
Mm.
just like, but, and
Calm
I
down.
also felt like he jumped to that. Let's go for this life-threatening transfusion before we've really explored other options. But I
Yeah.
suppose that was a filmmaking thing, wasn't it?
Well,
Of
it's a
like,
filmmaking thing, but also I think it portrays it underlines his eccentric character. So
oh yeah.
you have people going, "What? You're killing her!" And it's like, no, we must do this. This kind of there's that kind of dramatic tension. But it's interesting how,
And it also sets him up as an expert, doesn't it, as well? Of
yeah,
like, he's the only person that's
that's got
come
a handle
close
on
to,
this, or even vaguely
yeah, or
understands it.
knowing,
Yeah,
yeah, and knows that those symptoms are loss of blood, and everybody else hasn't sort of clocked that and stuff. So yeah,
twigged
it
it. Yeah,
was.
but it's interesting how when you go back to Nosferatu, what you have is not less of an explicit single character coming forward and combating the monster like Helsing, but you do have interesting use of scientific intrigue and footage that again people might not have seen for themselves.
Oh
It's
yes,
like the
I'd
Venus
forgotten about
flytrap, for
that.
example. So you have these little class of medical students learning about different types of carnivorous plants, and just
Mm.
this, and also actually I think isn't there's a shot of of blood and
Microbes, I think.
microbes, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think
in the
there is.
film,
Yeah,
which
under a
is
slide,
which
which is
is a
actually quite
special
difficult
effect
to
in its own
capture.
right. Absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah,
at that time it would have been very difficult to capture.
yeah. So you have this uh, you know this contrast between rural, mystical, somewhat modern, urban, scientific, industrial, and
Mm.
then you also have people in their own time in the 1920s being exposed to footage and ideas that might not have been commonplace. So it's interesting how, and this is where I think the story of Dracula is similar in terms of how it's certainly how it's portrayed in film to the story of Frankenstein's monster. In so much as it's a window into weird science and sort of this idea that you can blur the lines between the mystical and the real world by maybe put some electric probes in it. Let's see what happens. Bzz, oh, it's alive. That kind of thing. I find that really quite a juicy prospect, actually. No pun intended. It's just, yeah. But then though, of course, we have this meta response released in the year 2000, filmed in the late 90s. The Shadow of the Vampire,
which I made you watch almost straight after we'd watched Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Because
it feels like required viewing, actually, I think.
Yeah, but I find it such a interesting commentary on that movie, and almost the legacy of the movie and the rumors around the movie, and
yeah, absolutely,
brilliant.
So, and also, again, for the most part, it's played very straight.
It's played ever so straight. Yeah.
John Malkovich is Friedrich. Willem Dafoe as not the actor Max Schreck, but as a person called Max Schreck who is a vampire. And the rumors are that he's very method in his approach.
There's a bit, isn't there, where like he's sitting with the crew and he snatches a bat
out of the air
and eats it and then walks away. And the people there are not even remotely concerned that he's a real vampire. No. They're like, oh my God, he's so method.
Yeah, oh my
God.
So
method. You're just like, ah!
Yeah. But also, I think what's beautiful about that film, I mean, yes, you got those comedy elements. You've got the fact that clearly Murnau he's gone on a trip to Eastern Europe. He's bumped into this vampire and has made a deal with him. I'll capture you on film, and in return, you will get to eat the leading lady of the movie. But there's a point when clearly. So I'm just as I'm talking to you, the trailer is playing quietly in front of me. It's just hilarious. But there's this point when Willem Dafoe's character just can't stop eating members of the crew. So
they keep disappearing.
And Malkovich is like, "Will you stop this? I am the director. I am in charge.
You're not allowed to do this until the film is finished."
Again, that I think is beautiful because actually, beyond the vampire, beyond this butting of heads of technology and mystical, actually, I think there's a comment there on what it takes to make a movie, and the fact that directors may well even go so far as to offer up a cast member in order to get the thing finished, get it out there.
Yeah, and the end of that movie is so dark.
Yeah,
because they drug the lead. So they're playing out the last scene in Nosferatu.
Yeah,
and the last scene in Nosferatu is the leading lady asleep on the bed, and Count Orlok is going to go in, and so they put her in her place, and she sort of wakes up and fights him off because he is really biting and drinking her blood, and she is terrified. And they're like, and she's like, I don't want to do this, and so they drug her. They basically drug her, make her fall asleep so that she doesn't react to it, and then when she's kind of half coming round, which is exactly what it looks like in the real ending of the Nosferatu, and you sort of going, oh my God. And
there's Murnau he just keeps filming, even as his I think his camera his photographer is killed in that scene.
And everybody just keeps dying, and it's like, if it doesn't happen in front of the lens, it doesn't happen at all. And it just keeps going.
And actually, do you know what, there's a tiny little bit of the motivations that we talked about in the Blair Witch Project there, where
Mhm.
someone can get so obsessed with us, I need to get it on camera, I need to have this, I need to record this for posterity, that they lose their humanity in the process. And so it's a really dark comedy. It's
It's very
hilarious,
dark.
but also
And the main character, Jonathan Hatter,
yeah, Hatter, yeah.
Hatter is played by Eddie Izzard, and he looks identical.
Yeah, he really does.
He
Yeah, yeah.
looks literally identical
So he's playing the
to.
actor Gustav von Wangenheim.
Well done on that.
Thank you.
But yeah, but I couldn't believe it, because when I was watching Nosferatu, I was like, God, he really does look like Eddie Izzard. And then they pick Eddie Izzard to play him, and it is just brilliant.
Yeah. No, it's magnificent. But also, I think so. You've got that sort of meta commentary on how the filmmakers lose themselves, or the director loses himself to the process. But also as well, I think that moment or that scene where Willem Dafoe. Well, first of all, Willem Dafoe is bloody brilliant in it.
Oh my God, yeah.
He's just he's
You can
incredible.
hardly tell it's him.
Yeah.
And in a good way, in the sense that he embodies
Max Schreck,
that character so well. And it's so funny, because there's scenes where he just literally steals the show, doesn't he? And then you've got these moments where John Malkovich is just screaming at him, going, "Put it down!"
Yeah. No,
the director,
but,
you do
also,
what I say.
But also, it brilliantly explains some of the, because again, you have these 1920s film tropes that turn up in Nosferatu, where, for example, initially the relationship, the meeting between Hutter and Orlok. Orlok is very quickly, you've cut your finger, blood, and he almost has to sort of. And this is where there's a slight disconnect in the original Nosferatu, is that you've just seen basically what looks like an attempted, I don't know, attack or wrestling with each other, and then the next morning he's kind of writing a letter to his darling saying, "I have a weird mosquito bite on my neck." This kind, it's
Oh
kind of
God,
like,
yeah.
it's a very strange letter that he sends. It's like a one sentence letter, but it explains that strange acting, that strange sort of single-mindedness of Nosferatu, by having Willem Dafoe's Max Schreck being uncontrollable when he sees that he's cut his finger, and he's like, "Get him off me! Get him off me!" This is like...
But also, I mean, the bit that I really enjoyed as well was John Malkovich's voiceover when he's like telling the cast what to do live. He's like, "Yes, you are looking at the rose. You are playing with the cat. You are smelling the flowers. Lovely, nice day. Look up at the sky."
Yeah.
And then there's a bit with the book. It's like, "Look at the book. Look away from the book."
Yeah.
Like, throw the book away. You don't want to read it.
Yeah.
And that was also very. It was very. And it's all played really straight, but it was very, very funny in the sense of, like, it gives you this secondary layer of like what you're viewing when you view it. It's just it's very good.
Well, but also as well, they also not only obviously recreate the scenes from the film, but the scenes where we are seeing Max Schreck's vampire sort of going up the stairs, and we see his shadow go first, as it does in the film. So it's almost like, actually, that's the director. Murnau didn't actually plan on that in the movie. That's just how this vampire moves around.
But there's also that brilliant bit in it as well, where it's like, now we need to move on to the scenes on the boat, and Max Schreck is like, "I don't do water," and he's like, "Yes, you will do water." It's like, "No, I will not do water." And they're like, "Fine, I will build a boat."
Yeah, and they build a boat on the castle. Yeah. It's just magnificent.
But there's so many things like that where you're just like, "Oh, it's actually really funny." But it's all played dead straight, isn't it?
But it's played so straight that when you come to that scene where the actors are hanging out and talking, and it's ended with the snatching of the bat out of the air and the sort of rapid, quick, frantic feeding. Actually, before that, it's really quite poignant. You hear Max Schreck talking about how he can't make any vampires anymore, and how he's so old that he's forgotten things like his name or whatever, or he basically is describing this lonely existence that's so long and so isolated that he's almost forgetting how
Yeah, and his
how to
story,
be.
and that character, like he was basically found in a cave, wasn't he?
Yeah,
And almost rescued from this.
yeah, and sort of set, so the castle becomes a setting for the film, but also it's going all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning. It's literally one of the last chances that he has to interact with people in a way that's not completely feral. So but again, that's why long before I ever saw this film, that was the impression I got from Nosferatu, was this idea that this was a feral version of a vampire, that this was a borderline animal, um, but who's trying this last ditch effort to fold himself back into human society. Um, so I don't know. So in that sense, would you recommend the two have to be watched together, more or less? You have to watch uh, the
Shadow of the
original.
Vampire. Yeah, I mean, I personally think Shadow of the Vampire is well worth a watch.
Mm,
Well worth a watch.
hmm.
And I think you should watch Nosferatu first.
Yeah.
Basically, because I think I watched them the other way around, I have to admit. But actually part of watching Shadow of the Vampire, because it wasn't easy to get hold of Nosferatu when I wanted to.
No.
And so part of that, watching that, made me more so compelled to find a copy of it, get it on DVD, and be able to watch it, because I think it was quite expensive. I mean, I must have bought it over 10 years ago, and it was over £20,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, now you
which
can
is a
get.
lot of money for a DVD.
Yeah. I mean, now you can get it for £2.24 on DVD and like £12 on Blu-ray, but it must have been out of print at the time, I reckon.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to get hold of at all. And it it was just so good. And I think it's so clever how it kind of comments on the making of that movie and stuff. I
Did you know
just, yeah.
the only thing I would say on that note of making of the movie is that, and when we were watching Shadow of the Vampire, I was questioning this as we were going, is the use of light. So in that movie, they have lighting rigs set up. They have big lights on
Well,
tripods, and
that's because Max Shrek refuses to film in the day because he's a
yeah,
vampire.
yes, yeah, no, exactly, yes, yeah. But it's interesting how they. That's the one thing that for me broke it, actually,
Okay,
as a
yeah.
funny representation of this being the story of the filming of the film, is that we know that the original, they couldn't film at night because they didn't have adequate lighting rigs or electricity supply and this kind of thing to do that. So it's funny for the film, but it slightly breaks it for me seeing these lights set up in these
Yeah.
night
No,
shots.
I get that. And I to be honest though, I mean, I think it's so good you can overlook it.
Yeah, yeah,
And for me anyway, that didn't really bother me. I was just, I don't know, I just love the idea that he was a real vampire and that everybody just thought he was a method actor and people keep disappearing.
my
And
God,
they're
the
like,
man is amazing.
yeah, like, yeah. And
So
because he's,
committed.
yeah, so committed. And it's just really good.
Hmm.
And I just think it adds another layer to the myth.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
agree. So, Shadow of the Vampire is an excellent companion to, I think, Nosferatu, and if nothing
Hmm.
else, uh, it's a nice sort of tonal shift, but also I think it provides a sort of a loving reflection on just what it took to make a movie back in 1921.
Yeah, I actually think I mean, I seem to remember this being a thing. I might be wrong, but I seem to remember people finding Max Schreck's portrayal at the time so creepy that they wondered if he really was a vampire, which I think was the nugget of the
Yeah,
idea that turned into Shadow of the Vampire.
yeah,
So I think it came from kind of myths and legends surrounding the making of the film as well.
yeah,
So
yeah. They just found this dude. Yeah, he was just so
yeah,
intense. Um, but in that sense, though, the Bram Stoker's Dracula, and obviously there've been other versions of Dracula. Not that long ago, for example, there was a BBC TV series, Dracula.
yeah, I haven't watched that.
No, neither have I. But these are the three films that I think are probably mandatory viewing. In so much as Bram
Yeah.
Stoker's Dracula does go on to be a a loving sort of update, I guess, of some of
A
the visual
tribute.
techniques. A tribute, yeah, an homage to if nothing else, the visual storytelling. So the fact that they
Yeah.
really extend on Dracula's shadow capacity in that film.
Yeah, and
And
I think when you first meet Gary Oldman's rendition of Dracula,
mm,
you've got, I mean, you have a different aesthetic, but you
mm,
have the the pale skin, the
mm,
long fingers,
mm,
the sort of almost the beautifully manicured um fingernails and stuff,
mm,
don't you,
mm,
that come in later and stuff. And I think those are there because of Nosferatu.
mm, mm. Well, but and also there's that idea of what is it sort of enter freely of your own will and leave something of the warmth you bring with you.
Mm,
It is this idea that literally by entering the castle, William is contributing to the reawakening of Dracula and the reinfusion of his withered self into a living being. So that there's definitely that crossover, and he definitely starts off in a more Nosferatu state. But the fact that they play with so there's a point when they're projecting a map of London on the wall, I think,
yeah,
and
they
you
do quite a
see
lot of projections in the back, don't they?
yeah, and you have the shadow of Gary Oldman's Dracula going to. Uh, he does things like he approaches Keanu's. So I keep on calling him Keanu. He approaches
Jonathan.
Jonathan Harker's sort of neck or something, or he'll sort of look as though he's reaching and pointing at something, and then Harker will look up and find that actually Dracula's on the other side of the room. This idea of the
And there was that
shadow.
bit when he invites him into the carriage and his
Yeah,
arm stretches out, doesn't it?
yeah,
And
yeah,
it just goes on and on and on and on, and then
yeah,
it touches him and it's not there. And you're
yeah,
just like,
yeah,
it,
yeah.
it's creepy.
And there's this weird thing where he seemingly picks up Harker by the shoulder, and
Hmm.
with one motion just sort of moves him into the cabin of the carriage.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's good. Okay, I suppose the inevitable question there. I mean, we briefly touched on the fact that some people have tried to make things like TV series out of it. Is the time right for another uh, honest to goodness Dracula as opposed to vampire genre movie? 100
I
years
don't know.
on.
I mean, I mean, I would never say never
Mm-hmm.
because I think that as long as somebody's bringing something fresh to the table
Mm-hmm.
with I mean, that material is rich. Do you know what I
Mm,
mean? Like the book is rich, the story ideas are rich, the character of the vampire, the that monster
mm.
in essence is is classic in that sense.
Well,
So I
and
think as
people still go to Whitby, looking for Dracula's
yeah,
grave. Yeah. Mm,
yeah, and I mean, I think that Bram Stoker invented something there, didn't he? That has created a timeless place within culture.
mm,
And so I don't think that I mean I don't ever think that you should never revisit material. I always but I think what needs to happen is you need to bring something new
mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm,
also respectful of the history. And I mean, I think that's what Coppola managed to do with his rendition. I mean, there is a 1970s remake of Nosferatu, um, which I have seen, but we haven't really talked about it. I don't think it really adds anything, to be honest.
okay.
Um, but
Nosferatu the
there,
vampire.
yeah,
Yeah.
um, but it's just it is just a remake of the Nosferatu, and I don't think that really does very much. But I and it certainly didn't capture the zeitgeist in the same way. But I
No.
think, I mean, for me, the film that took me into the original Bram Stoker kind of story and mythos was the Coppola Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh,
Um,
that was Werner Herzog who
what
directed
was
it. The 1970s film. That's quite cool.
well, maybe we should watch it if you want.
Yeah, yeah, we can give it a go.
Yeah.
Um, but as you say, it doesn't seem as though it's necessary. Although, ironically enough, or so coincidentally enough, maybe, on the posters for Nosferatu the Vampire, spelt Vampyre.
Hmm.
Nosferatu looks like Willem Dafoe.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
does.
yeah.
Yeah,
It was
but yeah,
fated.
so I think for me, the definitive edition as it stands at the minute is the Francis Ford-Coppola version, and I
Mm,
think that film was made with such love for the source material, and you know, and to be honest, aside from Keanu Reeves' rather dodgy accent, for me, it's a nigh on perfect movie.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's one that every time you watch it, you find something new in.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, although it's a deviation from the Bram Stoker book with the love story, I'm a total sucker for a tragic love story.
Mm-hmm.
Happy endings don't do anything for me, but tragic, lost love holds a dear, dear place in my heart.
Oh, of course, yes. You're a sucker for people who can't be together. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm a total sucker for that. I absolutely
yeah.
love stories like that where it's like, this is true love, but we're destined to be apart. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, I
Yes,
totally
give me
love that stuff.
more. Yep.
Yeah. So for me, it hits all the right buttons, all the right notes. Do you know what I mean? But
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
that's not to say I don't think that that's not to say I wouldn't be open to something else. I wasn't particularly interested in the BBC version. I hadn't actually realised that that was a retelling of Dracula, like verbatim.
yeah.
I thought it was just a Dracula inspired thing,
Mm, mm.
but I don't know. It may well be.
No, I think it was yeah, an attempt to sort of to. Well, the problem is that there's been a few series like that the BBC have done in recent years. Probably for me, the most successful one was the Three Musketeers. That was quite good fun, uh, but yeah, I suppose to put it another way, they're filling a drama remit as opposed to have someone
Yeah.
having a passion for the source material and running
I
with
tell
it.
you what I think was the best thing that I've seen recently on vampires, which I just couldn't believe how good it was, is What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yep,
I
yep.
that was very in line with, because they had the like Max Shrek style vampire in the cupboard or something, didn't they? Was that the
Yes,
movie version? But that
down in the
was,
cellar, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was, I thought, very, very clever,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
a modern day twist. And I really enjoyed that.
But
Uh,
again, it plays with the need for the vampire to have a connection with changing times
yeah.
and what they're desperate for. I can't remember if it was the series or the movie that in this instance, but what they're desperate for is a way in. So they're trying to invite themselves. Basically, it's like they're going speed dating, but
Oh yeah, it's so funny. But then, I was thinking about this now a little bit more. But I mean, I very much enjoy the Chronicle of the Vampire stuff. The Anne Rice stuff.
yeah,
And one of the main things I enjoy about that is that there's a very small community of vampires that have the capacity to live for millennia, so to
mm,
speak. And
mm,
so there's lots of vampires made and they kind of just they don't live for a long time for whatever reason. They can't cope with it emotionally or whatever. And so there ends up to be this very small community of like, I think it's like maximum 10. I think it's like 6 or 7 of them that
mm-hmm,
they don't, and they hang out for years together, and they don't, and they've all got kind of an interconnected history. And that that again is that search, because I mean, that I think is the tragedy of the vampire story, actually, is that although you are timeless, you are
mm,
also set in a time, and therefore you are in a way apart and disconnected from the times that come later that you have to integrate into.
yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, to be honest,
and
I have a hard enough time with Snapchat. Never mind.
it's because
Never mind.
Snapchat shit.
Exactly, exactly. But
Do you
apparently,
know what there is now that probably haven't even heard of it? Be Real. You
no, I
heard of
haven't
Be
heard it.
Real?
No, no,
Oh,
no.
right. So Be Real is where you take a picture and it takes a picture of front and back camera,
Okay,
and then it gets published once a day and everybody sees it once a day. And the kids are all loving this Be Real thing at the minute, that because they're
interesting.
being real, because they're taking a picture both sides of the
Like,
camera.
I see. So where they are and what they look like. Yeah.
Yeah.
or how messy their bedroom is. Yeah.
Yeah, or
Um,
whatever it is. Yeah.
yeah. Well, what's it? But there you go. There you go. You see, you're helping me connect with the 21st century, Ruth. Thank you. Um, no, yeah, but yeah, as you said, that is part of this mythology and part of the tragedy, and it's certainly there. It's present in Nosferatu from the beginning. I think beyond the thematics, though, I think as a technical achievement, as a technical document of filmmaking and also a marker, this idea of it being 100 years on, I do
Mm.
recommend watching it because as I say, on the one hand, so much has changed. On the other hand, so little has changed. I find it really interesting how compelling it is as a story, considering it looks like the kind of thing that you might be able to, well, no, you could easily pull off on a fairly old smartphone these days.
Yeah.
And the acting isn't stellar. It's not out of this world, but that's because they're learning how to act to camera, and it's because they're thinking about it in a slightly different artistic way. So it feels human. It feels very human, even though it's 100 years old. And I think, and it's part of that wonderful progression of technology and the relationship between the storytellers and the audience, and now, I mean, I suppose ultimately, if you didn't have this sort of progression, simple things like what an edit cut is and how
Mm.
music cues relate to the hero, or what what we can expect from like a soft fade might mean time has passed from one scene to another.
Yeah.
All this sort of stuff is stuff that we just know, and it's like we've been trained, and we've all learned together what a film is and how it works and how.
And what the
Uh,
different things mean,
yeah,
which is what I was
exactly.
trying to say earlier, I think,
Yeah,
with the
yeah,
acting, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of like the actual mechanical nature of the edit and the filming process. But I suppose that's true as well.
yeah,
You're buying into a common language at that point that was in its infancy.
yeah. Well, but also as well, I mean, in a really fundamental way, we are all buying into something when we step into the cinema. You know, it's not remotely real. It's just a big experience. It's a big screen. It's a big sound, and then you're taking on this story. You're taking on this journey, and you often hear filmmakers talking about in a slightly sort of twee sort of way the magic of the movies. But I think just going back and looking at a film from so long ago, you can get a sense of actually how immediate that magic was and how effective it was, and how presumably at any given time cinema has felt just as exciting. I suppose.
Mm.
I think, yeah. Um, so, what would you say to someone who isn't yet convinced? Then, when it comes to watching a silent black and white film, how would you? I mean, how would you sell it to like kids in a classroom, for example?
Do you know? I don't know. I mean, I have spoken to kids about it before and about how like I think I just tell people what I like about it in the sense of like it's very interesting to see how
Hmm.
storytelling was done in that silent era. It's a very different way of telling a story.
Hmm.
Um, it's wonderful, I think, to see where all of these kind of Dracula tropes and images that we associate with Dracula were first spawned, where they first came into being.
Hmm.
And I think that that's one of the things is like you don't even realize that some of those are tropes until you see it in this, and then you're like, oh, that's this is not a trope here.
Yeah.
This is the birth of
Mm-hmm.
this trope.
Mm-hmm.
um and also I find it fascinating that it's so able to be scary and sinister
Mm-hmm.
and almost get under your skin,
Hmm. Hmm.
in that sense. So I think it's worth watching because it's a good story, it's well told, it's historically interesting, and it does have the capacity to be contemporarily scary in a modern like horror
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we
style.
watched it in the dark,
Yeah.
close to Halloween, and just let it take us, especially with the soundtrack as well. their companies. It works really well. Yeah. So, what are we talking about next time?
So I think we're talking about what makes a Christmas movie a Christmas movie.
Oh.
Either that or Avatar 2.
Oh yeah, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Yeah, if we get to go and see Avatar.
One of those will be next, because it will depend on when we go and see Avatar 2. But I think that's going to be happening sort of in either order. But yes, so the multiverse calls the diner back into its swirling depths. The warm conversation and cosmic mystery must depart for now. We will materialize again somewhere new in time and space. But for now, it's goodbye from the Else Realm Diner.
Else Realm Diner.